Long Voyage Back, Rheinhart, 1983, page 276. It only took them a few days on St. Thomas to realise that conditions were appalling. Black antipathy to white strangers was palpable in glances and gestures at every moment. In the months since the war, the food shortages had already taken their toll. People looked gaunt, walked slowly, squabbled violently over the tiniest disagreement about food or water. Soon realised that the black men fishing at every bridge and breakwater and along most of the docks were not fishing for leisure, but for survival. The street vendor haggling over the price of 2 oranges was haggling not because of cultural tradition, but out of economic desperation. The voluptuous black mother who spent 20 minutes in the store manager's private office was not cold-hearted or neurotic, but only a human being gratefully cashing in her last economic asset. In this world there were no luxuries, only necessities. Human society on St. Thomas was falling apart. The government was still paying its employees in paper dollars, which were no longer being accepted by the few farmers, fishermen and merchants who had anything worth selling. Consequently, government employees, once the island's elite, were now working for nothing, whereas most of the other workers, half the population was unemployed, bargained to be paid in food and water. Pot smoking and prostitution were now public and open, since there were no facilities to jail offenders in, no food to feed them with, and only unpaid disgruntled policemen to arrest and guard them. Bicycles and mules were the popular vehicles in the New World. The airport was usually empty of both planes and people, since most private planes had flown south, and regular commercial flights to anywhere had ended when the fuel ran out or pirates made off with the planes. The sight of an airplane over St. Thomas 2 days after Vagabond arrived had sent such a rush of people from the town to the airport that when Neil saw it, he thought he was witnessing some annual island bike race, over 100 people pedalling out to the airport, as if their lives depended on it. Everyone who could afford to leave either had left or was trying to. With the food inadequate on all the islands, the poor, with nothing to lose, were beginning to demand forcefully their share of what little was left. On their first walk through the sheets of Charlotte Emile, Neil, Frank and Jean had seen the broken and unboarded windows of supermarkets and grocery stalls, all of which were now empty and deserted. Some downtown blocks had so many looted and abandoned stores it seemed the revolution must already have occurred, and yet the local whites they were able to talk to still spoke as if they feared a black uprising and takeover. There were 4 old tanks parked along the waterfront. Except for the 3 white enclaves outside of town and St. Thomas Hilton, Neil didn't see that there was much left on St. Thomas of value to take over. Settling on St. Thomas began to seem increasingly unlikely. In the first few days Frank was offered 2 different houses in exchange for Vagabond, but the desperation and hopelessness with which the owners made their offers sobered Frank considerably. He discussed with Neil the possibility of selling Vagabond to raise enough gold to fly most or maybe all of them to Brazil. But the prospect of arriving destitute in Brazil was unpleasant and, worse, they would have to sell the boat before they could strike a solid bargain with a pilot. And to complicate their situation still more, the news from the other Caribbean islands and from the rest of the world was dismal. Although the war seemed to be at a standstill, conditions worldwide were still getting worse. No one dared to declare the war was over. No government proudly announced victory or abjectly offered surrender. But reports of recent fighting had ceased, at least amongst the major powers. Battles for food and skirmishes between refugees and neutral countries trying to keep them out was increasing. US government officials, still speaking from some unidentified underground headquarters, after 3 weeks of exhorting their fellow citizens to rally to defeat the Soviet Union, now spoke only of the steps that would have to be taken to save the surviving population. Although the government had spoken, there was no evidence that anyone was listening. From what could be gathered from the shortwave radio and the occasional newscasts on the local AM station, the country seemed to be divided up into isolated pockets of survivors, each struggling independently to cope with their particular problems. Reports seemed to imply that more than 2/3 of the US population was already dead. Mass starvation on the mainland of the US had not yet been reported. It was July, and the survivors had plenty of natural growing things for nourishment, if they lived in areas uncontaminated by radiation. But throughout much of the rest of the world, this was the problem. Other diseases were now beginning to claim as many victims as radiation sickness and burns. Dysentery, typhoid and cholera were becoming epidemic throughout those areas of the world where loss of electricity and overcrowding meant reduced and polluted water supplies. Worst of all, the mysterious disease from the western United States was spreading to places untouched by missiles, as it had to the Virgin Islands. Colombia, Venezuela and 4 Central American countries had forbidden all immigration from the north, quarantining or exiling anyone caught illegally within their borders. The flu virus that had been talked about weeks earlier was now definitely more than a flu, but the etiology of the plague remained unknown. All that had been established was that the incubation period was between a week and 10 days, that transmission seemed to have been oral, through ingestion of contaminated food or water, or through mouth contact with someone infected. Flies that had been in contact with the sweat of an infected person could also contaminate the food. Prognosis was known now too. The disease began with stomach cramps, then a fever, then a high fever that might last 5 or 6 days, followed either by death or a remission of symptoms. Treatment was to reduce and control the fever, medication, ice packs, fluids, etc. Unfortunately, none of them were very successful. Altogether, about a quarter of the victims survived with no apparent permanent damage, and another quarter survived but seemed to be debilitated by the disease, lacking in energy and endurance, and about half died. As a result, international travel and trade had almost stopped. Jean and Neil listened to a report that the Venezuelan Air Force had threatened to shoot down a Boeing 747 that had requested to land in Caracas after an 8-hour flight from Toronto, Canada. When the plane was almost out of fuel and circling outside the city, the Air Force did shoot it down. No one survived. For the first time, Vagabond's crew discussed returning to the US mainland, since it appeared that they could still find enough food and perhaps a more friendly welcome. But Neil argued that radioactive fallout would be increasing for months, if not years, not diminishing, and the problem of avoiding the plague and of avoiding the violence of those who would fear them as carriers was also frightening. Moreover, most of the stored and growing food would already have been confiscated and controlled by previous settlers in each area, and when winter came, these sources would be barely enough for them. Outsiders would not only be feared and kept away because of the plague, but because of the burden they would place on the already limited carrying capacity of the region. Neil had listened to one shortwave report of a small renegade group of soldiers and a band of survivalists fighting a pitched battle for the food and shelter the survivalists had prepared. The broadcaster didn't know who had won, but it wasn't a game that anyone aboard Vagabond had any heart for. Thus, although their stay in the harbour at Charlotte Amille permitted them to recover from the weariness of being at sea for almost 3 weeks, by the end of a week a new kind of weariness was afflicting them, the fatigue of searching endlessly for some end to the threat of starvation, and finding none. Ollie, with help usually from Jim, Lisa and Katya, spent most of the day fishing, sometimes with hook and line, sometimes with a net from the shore, or raking for shellfish. Frank, possessive of Jean, took on with her the task of bartering for what little food was available in the city. Over the week they bartered away dozens of useless trinkets, watches, shirts, shoes, necklaces, blouses, a transistor radio, the rest of Macklin's stolen cigarettes, Jim's remaining supply of grass. Yet during the week they ate no better than they had at sea, and had no more reserve food supply than they had when they first dropped anchor. They were running to stand still. So almost from their first day on the torpid streets of Charlotte Amille, Jean felt lost and uneasy. She had arrived wanting to find a home for herself and Neil and the others, for the alternative seemed to be an endless voyage from one hostile place to the other. But as she talked to government officials, to shopkeepers, as she pushed her way through the devastated and littered streets or along the waterfront bartering for food, she could feel no connection with anyone, black or white, mostly just a powerful, sullen hostility. She felt herself out of sync with the island and its people. By the 3rd day, she was just going through the motions. She wanted to leave. It wasn't simply that she was white in a world that was mostly black. It was more than colour. She sensed that for those who had lived on the islands for a few years, anyone who had arrived after the Holocaust, black, white, or Puerto Rican, was an outsider, an intruder, even, she realised with a start, a coward. To have fled one's homeland was to be guilty of selfish betrayal, even if that homeland had been blown off the earth and the homeland become a vast crematorium. and the anger and contempt which most of the long-time residents responded to her and the other refugees was undoubtedly intensified by their own fear and their own desire to flee to some ultimately secure haven. A black woman whom she casually tried to befriend in the fish stall turned on her with unexpected hatred. "Go away, rich lady," she said fiercely. "You best fly while you can." The woman's rebuke acted to reawaken Jean's own fears, made her begin calculating if she was still rich enough to flee. It hadn't taken long to learn beyond any doubt the universality of the currency Philippa called pot and pussy. Marijuana joints were traded as cigarettes had been during earlier wars. Bags of it were the big bills of island currency, and some women, if they were young and attractive and otherwise destitute, went to buy necessities from certain merchants, quite reconciled to paying with their mouths or bodies. One merchant they'd heard about had, because of his own physical limitations, resorted to selling water or fruit or fish to certain women for IOUs, to be upon demand of bearer, who would not necessarily be the merchant himself. He, in turn, used the sexual IOUs to buy things he wanted from other merchants. The second real estate agent Gina called upon, a dignified black man of her own age, had offered her a month's free rent in a cottage he had at his disposal in return for her friendship. The suggestion seemed to her not so much insulting as irrelevant, but it contributed to her feelings of unease about St. Thomas. So too did what was happening to Lisa and Jim. On the second trip ashore, the two had discovered in the downtown city park a gathering of teenagers, black and white, the only aspect of local life that seemed comfortably integrated, playing guitars and drums, singing, smoking pot, even laughing, often gathering around the latest street corner prophet who was haranguing about doom or salvation, or both. Almost every day, after they worked with Ollie, fishing or gathering shellfish, they went ashore and spent some time with their new friends. Katia sometimes went with them. Lisa, although younger than most of the others, seemed determined to fit in with this society, which disturbed Jean, mainly because she knew so little about them and had no control over Lisa's activities on the shore. She could feel Lisa pulling away from her. Lisa and Jim would answer her questions about the Park Square people with the code word replies. They were cool, loving people. They were non-violent. But Jean felt only a dull feeling of dread, or what seemed an aimless passivity in the face of starvation and disease. Katie didn't help matters when she said that Jim and Lisa were just trying to hold on to a little more of their normal lives before existence was, once again, solely devoted to day-to-day survival. And finally, the other thing that made her feel out of place in Charlotte Ami was the absence of Neil. Since he stayed so often on the boat, or off on other people's boats, she had no heart for the land. Neil was a major part of any home, and if he was rejecting St. Thomas, then she must too. And so, after 6 days, she felt that she was back where she had been on day one, on a ship without enough food to leave and without enough food to stay, unable to live with the man she loved because it would destroy the family that was her new world, and her children, whom she had vowed to save, to whom she wanted to dedicate her life, grew steadily thinner, and Lisa steadily more remote. The climax came one afternoon when Lisa was preparing to go ashore with Jim to visit their Park Square friends. Jean confronted her down in the cabin as Lisa was changing from wet clothes she'd worn earlier while singing for bait along the shore with Ollie, Jim and Tony. "Lisa, sweetheart," Jean said to her, "I hardly see you these days. What do you do in the city every day?" "We don't do anything, Mother," Lisa answered, slipping out of a one-piece suit and into panties and shorts. As she did, Jean noticed that Lisa seemed to be trying to show that she was unaffected by her own nakedness, not hiding her breasts as she'd done for most of the last 2 years. "For 7 or 8 hours?" Jean asked, regretting her accusatory tone. "That's not much to do, you know," Lisa replied, not looking at her mother. "This isn't exactly Washington." I know," Jean said, trying to get away from the confrontational mood. "What do you talk about?" "Lots of things," Lisa answered, pulling a blouse over her head. She no longer wore a bra, partly because the only one she'd bought with her had worn out. "But what are some of them, sweetheart?" Jean persisted. "I'm interested in your life, remember?" "Oh, Mother," Lisa said with a sigh. "It's hard to tell you about a lot of things, the way you adults messed up the world, about how to scrounge for food, and about what we want to do with our lives." "How do most of your friends manage to get food?" Jean asked, handing Lisa the brush she knew she was glancing around for. "Some of them fish," Lisa answered, beginning to brush her hair. "Garbage cans outside the rich white people's homes. A few go house to house begging." Your friends beg? Jean asked. Certainly, Mother. Lisa snapped back. There are no jobs and no food. What do you expect? Don't their parents manage to provide food? Sometimes, said Lisa, but most of us want to be independent of our parents. By begging? It's better than blowing the world apart. I don't see how the parents here are responsible for the war, Jean responded, feeling annoyed by Lisa's self-righteousness. Some of them are white, Mother, Lisa said, if that explained it, and Robbie says all whites started it with their super-rationality. Ah, said Jean, knowing she was too annoyed to enter reasonably into an abstract discussion. I see. That's why music is so important, said Lisa. Yes, said Jean, standing uncertainly in front of Lisa, who was ready to leave. Tell me, sweetheart, is Jim your lover now? Lisa, who was about to escape, stood still, her eyes on the floor. She turned back to face Jean and slowly raised her eyes. Yes, Mother, she answered quietly, without defiance or apology. Jean, who'd been holding her breath, let out a sigh. I see. You and Neil, Lisa began. It's all right, honey, Jean said, biting her lip and averting her face to look out the window. Jim's a fine man. I love him, Mother, Lisa said in a low, uncertain voice. I know, honey, Jean said and went over and hugged Lisa to her. I know. They held each other for half a minute until Jim's voice called out to Lisa from the dinghy alongside Vagabond. But, Lisa, Jean said, releasing her daughter but blocking her path, I don't want you abandoning the boat. Stay here. Make love here if you must. It's not that, she said, and inexplicably she seemed irritable again. You don't understand. There's no life for us on the boat. Nothing more of the violence Neil and Frank seem to believe in. Some of the people in the meal are different, and Jim and I are interested in finding a better world. Jean felt herself stiffen, again, at Lisa's naive oversimplifications. It made her feel both sad and frightened that her daughter seemed to need to escape from the boat and the adults on it. Their world was falling apart. But honey, she began. I'm going, Lisa announced and brushed past Jean and left the cabin. Jean followed, and as Lisa climbed down onto the dinghy, she wanted to call her back or give her warning of some sort, but she couldn't articulate her fears even to herself. Lisa, she called down to her, I want you to find the better world, but just be certain it is a better world. For a moment Lisa pretended to busy herself with helping Jim fit an oar into the oarlock, but then she looked up at her mother defiantly. Can't be any worse than the one that sent us here to starve to death, she said. Jean, feeling she had nothing better to offer Lisa, could only look down in shocked silence. Jim, smiling up at her awkwardly, shoved off and slowly rowed Lisa away.